The first rule they teach you about guarding an empty building is that no building is ever truly empty. Concrete settles, pipes hiss, drafts catch in old ventilation shafts and sound exactly like human whispers if you let your imagination run long enough. But the second rule, the one the veterans only tell you after your first week, is that if you hear footsteps echoing your own on the rounds, you never, ever turn around. You just keep walking, punch your clock, and pray whatever is matching your pace loses interest. I spent 10 years working night security for corporate high-rises and abandoned warehouses. I thought I knew every trick the dark could play on a tired mind, but none of that prepared me for the Blackwood Estate. It sits 50 miles deep into the Colorado mountains, a massive luxury resort built in the 1920s for the ultra-rich to escape the world. It's a sprawling beast of mahogany, brass, and dark stone, complete with 400 guest rooms, 2 grand ballrooms, and a labyrinth of subterranean service tunnels. Every winter, when the snow completely blocks a mountain pass, the resort shuts down for 4 months. The guests leave, the staff goes home. The only person left behind is the winter caretaker, me. The pay was ridiculous. Enough to clear my debts and buy a house in cash by the spring thaw. I should have asked why the salary was so high for walking around an empty hotel. I should have asked why the previous caretaker quit halfway through November and left his car, his clothes, and his wallet behind. My first 3 weeks were completely normal. I established a routine. Wake up at 4 p.m., eat breakfast in the massive, silent industrial kitchen, and start my rounds at 6 p.m. sharp as the sun dipped behind the jagged peaks. The security room was in the basement, a bunker filled with 30 glowing monitors feeding from cameras positioned all over the state. I'd watch the screens for an hour, then grab my heavy flashlight and the physical punch clock. There were 20 keys bolted to the walls at the furthest corners of the estate. I had to walk to each one, insert the key into my clock, and stamp the time. It was an old-school system designed to prove I was actually walking the property and not just sleeping in the basement. The storm hit on a Tuesday in late December. It wasn't just snow. It was a wide-out blizzard that swallowed the hotel entirely. The wind screamed against the reinforced glass of the grand lobby with enough force to make the heavy chandeliers tremble. The temperature outside dropped to -20. Inside, the ancient boiler system clanked and groaned, fighting to keep the ambient temperature just above freezing to stop the pipes from bursting. I was doing my 2 a.m. round on the 4th floor. The 4th floor is where the most expensive suites are located. Thick carpet that swallows your footsteps, heavy oak doors, and long, straight corridors that seem to stretch on forever. I was walking down the east wing, sweeping my flashlight beam back and forth. The power was stable, but the emergency lighting in the hallways was dim, casting long, warped shadows. I reached the end of the hall, took the key bolted next to the window, and punched my clock. Click-clack. The mechanical sound was deafening in the silence. I turned around to head back to the stairwell. That's when I noticed it. Room 414. The door was open, just a crack, maybe 2 inches. I stopped dead. Every door in the hotel had been locked, double-checked, and sealed by the management team before they left. I had personally walked this exact hallway every night for 21 days, and that door had always been flush with the frame. I gripped my flashlight tighter, the heavy metal feeling cold through my gloves. I approached the door slowly. The air in the hallway was freezing, easily around 40 degrees. But as I got closer to 414, I felt a wave of heat radiating from the crack in the door. Not just warm air, stifling, suffocating heat, like an open oven. I pushed the door open with the head of my flashlight. The hinges didn't make a sound. The inside of the suite was pitch black. I clicked my beam onto its highest setting and swept the room. It was a standard luxury suite. A massive king bed, heavy velvet curtains drawn tight over the windows, a sitting area with leather armchairs. But the air was impossibly thick. I stepped inside, my boots silent on the plush carpet. I shined my light toward the bedside table. There was a glass of water sitting there. The ice inside it was still clinking, melting against the glass. Condensation dripped down the sides. Someone had just poured it. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I swept the room again, faster this time. The bathroom door was wide open. I moved toward it, keeping my back to the wall. I peered around the edge of the doorframe. The bathroom was empty, but the mirror was completely fogged over with thick steam. Water was still dripping from the showerhead, hitting the porcelain tub with a steady, rhythmic tap. Someone was here, 50 miles from the nearest plowed road, in the middle of a deadly blizzard, inside a locked hotel. Someone had just taken a shower. I backed out of the room, my heart hammering against my ribs. I pulled the door shut, hearing the heavy lock click into place, and ran. I didn't care about the rules. I didn't care about the noise. I sprinted down the hallway, took the stairs 2 at a time, and didn't stop until I had locked myself inside the basement security room. I was breathing hard, staring at the bank of 30 monitors. I dropped into the desk chair and immediately started rewinding the footage for the 4th floor east wing. The camera angle was positioned at the far end of the hall, looking down the corridor toward room 414. I scrubbed back 2 hours. Nothing. The hallway was perfectly still. I scrubbed forward, minute by minute. At 1:45 a.m., the screen flickered. A burst of heavy static washed over the feed, scrambling the image into jagged lines of black and white. It lasted for exactly 3 seconds. When the picture cleared, the door to 414 was open. No one walked down the hall. No one unlocked it. The static cleared, and the door was just open. I kept watching. At 2:03 a.m., I saw myself enter the frame on the monitor. I watched my tiny black and white double walk down the hall, punch the clock, turn around, and freeze when he noticed the door. I watched myself push the door open and step inside. But that wasn't what made my blood run cold. As I watched myself step into the dark room on the screen, the camera feed glitched again. Just a minor tear in the video. And suddenly, there was a figure standing in the hallway right behind me. It was impossibly tall. Its head scraped the ceiling of the corridor, contorted and bent at a grotesque angle to fit within the space. It had no defining features, just a silhouette of ragged, deep shadow that seemed to absorb the emergency lighting around it. It stood perfectly still, directly behind my back as I stood in the doorway of 414. On the screen, I saw myself back out of the room and pull the door shut. The tall shadow didn't move. I saw myself turn and sprint away down the hall, running right through the figure as if it were made of smoke. As soon as I was out of frame, the tall shadow turned its bent head slowly toward the security camera. It raised a long, impossibly thin arm and pointed directly at the lens. Then the monitor went dead, just a flat, black screen. I pushed my chair back from the desk, my breathing loud in the confined bunker. The other 29 monitors were still broadcasting. The lobby, the kitchen, the ballrooms, all empty, all silent. I grabbed the 2-way radio from the desk. It was supposed to connect me to a county dispatch office in case of emergencies, though the storm had been interfering with the signal all day. I pressed the transmission button. Dispatch, this is Blackwood Security. Do you copy? Over. Static hissed through the speaker. A thick, wet sound, like someone breathing through a layer of water. Dispatch, this is Blackwood Security. I have an intruder on the premises. I need immediate law enforcement assistance. Do you copy? The static changed pitch. It stretched and warped, molding itself into a voice I instantly recognized. It was mine. I pushed the door open with the head of my flashlight. My own voice whispered through the radio speaker. It sounded breathless, terrified. The hinges didn't make a sound. I dropped the radio on the desk like it was burning my hand. It was repeating what I had just thought, what I had just experienced verbatim in my exact voice. I backed out of the room. The radio continued, my voice echoing in the concrete bunker, my heart hammering against my ribs. I pulled the door shut. I reached out and yanked the power cord from the back of the radio receiver. The bunker plunged into silence. Only the hum of the remaining monitors filled the space. I stared at the blank screen of the 4th floor camera. Whatever was up, there wasn't just a squatter. It wasn't some lost hiker seeking shelter from the blizzard. It was something else. Something that shouldn't exist. I should have stayed in the basement. I had heavy steel doors, a week's worth of food, and emergency power. But the boiler room was located on the opposite side of the basement. If the pressure valves weren't checked manually every 4 hours, The system would fail, the pipes would freeze, and the entire hotel would become a tomb of solid ice. I checked my watch. 3:15 a.m. I was due to check the valves in 15 minutes. I grabbed my flashlight, unclipped the heavy steel batten from my belt, and walked toward the bunker door. The basement corridor was a stark contrast to the luxury above. Bare concrete, exposed wiring, and dripping pipes. It smelled like old iron and damp earth. The boiler room was at the end of a long, straight tunnel that ran directly beneath the main ballroom. I stepped out of the security room and locked the heavy door behind me. As soon as the deadbolt clicked, the lights in the basement tunnel flickered and died. Total, absolute darkness. I snapped my flashlight on. The beam cut a sharp cone through the black. Dust motes danced in the light. The temperature down here was usually warm, heated by the massive industrial boilers, but now I could see my own breath misting in front of my face. The cold was unnatural. It sank into my bones instantly, making my joints ache. I started walking. The only sound was the heavy thud of my boots on the concrete. I kept my light aimed dead ahead, fighting the urge to look over my shoulder. Remember the second rule, never turn around. Halfway down the tunnel, the architecture changed. I had walked this path dozens of times. It was a straight shot, maybe 200 feet long, ending in the double metal doors of the boiler room. But as I kept walking, the walls seemed to pull away from me. The ceiling stretched upward, vanishing into the shadows beyond the reach of my flashlight. The concrete floor transitioned smoothly into a deep, rich mahogany wood. I stopped. I shined my light down at my feet. The rough concrete of the service tunnel was gone. I was standing on the polished wood floor of the grand ballroom, but that was impossible. The ballroom was on the first floor. I was 50 feet underground. I slowly raised my beam. The vast expanse of the ballroom stretched out before me. The massive crystal chandeliers hung dead and dark from a vaulted ceiling, but the room wasn't empty. Positioned perfectly in the center of the massive dance floor were dozens of chairs. They were the heavy, velvet-upholstered chairs from the dining room. There had to be at least 50 of them, arranged in a perfect, tight circle, all facing inward. I swallowed hard, the sound loud in the cavernous room. I hadn't moved those chairs. No one had. They had been stacked and covered with tarps in the dining hall across the estate. I took a step forward, the wood creaking under my weight. As soon as my foot touched the floor, a sound echoed through the dark. It was a slow, deliberate scrape, the sound of heavy wood dragging against polished flooring. It came from the circle of chairs. I swept my light over the arrangement. Nothing moved, but as the beam washed over the velvet seats, I realized they weren't entirely empty. Resting on the seat of the chair, directly facing me was a small, square object. I didn't want to get closer. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around, to run blindly back into the dark and find the security room. But the geography of the hotel had changed. If I turned around, I had no idea what hallway or room I would be stepping into. The building was shifting around me. I approached the circle of chairs slowly, keeping my flashlight aimed at the object. As I got within 10 feet, I saw what it was. It was a physical punch clock, the heavy metal device I carried on my belt to stamp my rounds. My hand dropped to my side. The leather holster was empty. I hadn't even felt it unclip. I stepped into the center of the circle of chairs. The air in here was stiflingly hot, exactly like the air outside room 414. I reached down and picked up the clock. There was a fresh time stamp punched into the paper dial. It was stamped with the current time, 3:32 a.m. But next to the time, printed in the same dark blue ink the machine used, was a single word, found. A sharp, deafening crack echoed through the ballroom. The sound of a heavy door slamming shut. The echo bounced off the vaulted ceiling, ringing in my ears. I spun around, sweeping my light frantically across the vast room. The beam caught the far wall. The grand double doors of the ballroom entrance were sealed shut, but standing directly in front of the doors, facing me, was a tall, shadowed figure from the security footage. It was even more terrifying in person. It didn't look like a physical creature. It looked like a tear in the fabric of the room, a void shaped like an elongated, broken man. Its head was tilted so far to the right it rested against its own shoulder, and it was taking a step toward me. I backed up, hitting the ring of chairs. "Stay back," I yelled, raising my steel baton as if it would do any good against a shadow. My voice trembled, sounding small and pathetic in the massive room. The figure took another step. It didn't walk normally. It sort of dragged itself, its limbs moving with a jerky, stop-motion quality, close in the distance terrifyingly fast. 50 feet, 40 feet, 30 feet. I scrambled over the chairs, breaking the circle, and ran toward the service doors behind the bandstand at the back of the room. These doors led to the kitchen. I hit the swinging doors full force, expecting them to burst open. Instead, I slammed into solid brick. I fell backward, shining my light at the doors. There was no wood, no hinges. Where the kitchen door should have been, there was a perfectly smooth, solid brick wall. The hotel had sealed the exit. The dragging footsteps behind me grew louder. Scrape, step, scrape, step. I spun around, pressing my back against the cold brick. The tall figure was 10 feet away. Up close, the shadow wasn't empty. It was made of thousands of tiny, moving geometric patterns, shifting and folding into each other. The air around it smelled like ozone and burning hair. The figure stopped. It slowly raised an impossibly long, thin arm, but it didn't point at me. It pointed to my left. I turned my head. Embedded in the brick wall, nearly perfectly camouflaged, was a narrow wooden door. It looked old, much older than the 1920s architecture of the resort. It was made of rotting, splintered wood with a heavy, rusted iron latch. The dragging sound started again. The figure was moving closer. 7 feet, 5 feet. The cold radiating off, it was burning my skin. I grabbed the iron latch of the wooden door, threw my weight into it, and tumbled into the dark. I slammed the door shut behind me just as a massive, heavy impact hit the other side. The wood bowed inward, splinters raining down on my face, but the rusted iron held. I lay on the floor in pitch black, gasping for air. My flashlight had rolled a few feet away. I grabbed it and shined it around my new surroundings. I wasn't in the hotel anymore. The walls around me were made of raw, jagged stone. Condensation dripped from the ceiling, pooling in muddy puddles on the uneven floor. The air was thick with the smell of wet earth and decay. It was a natural cave system, a tunnel boring deep into the mountain rock. I stood up, my legs shaking. I looked back at the door I had just come through. It stood alone in the middle of a rocky alcove, attached to absolutely nothing. Just a wooden door standing freely in a cave. I stepped behind it. Nothing. Just more rock. I walked back around the front. The hotel was gone. I was trapped underground. I turned my flashlight down the tunnel. The beam penetrated maybe 40 feet before being swallowed by the gloom. The path sloped sharply downward. There was no way out but forward. I started walking. The silence down here was absolute. No wind, no creaking wood, no groaning pipes. Just the dripping of water and my own ragged breathing. After walking for what felt like an hour, the tunnel began to widen. The rough stone walls smoothed out, transitioning from natural cave back into man-made architecture. But it wasn't the luxury mahogany of the estate. It was concrete block, industrial steel, and fluorescent lighting fixtures bolted to the ceiling. The tunnel opened into a wide, subterranean corridor. The lights were actually on down here, humming with a low, sick yellow glow. I clicked my flashlight off to save the battery. I walked down the center of the corridor. The walls were lined with heavy steel doors, spaced exactly 10 feet apart. They looked like isolation cells, or holding tanks. I approached the first door on the left. There was a small reinforced glass viewing window set into the metal at eye level. The glass was thick and dirty. I wiped it with my sleeve and peered inside. The room was small, maybe 10 by 10. In the center of the room, sitting on a metal chair, was a man. He was wearing a heavy winter coat, snow boots, and a thick woolen hat. He was perfectly still, staring at the blank concrete wall in front of him. I tapped on the glass. "Hey!" I yelled, my voice muffled by the thick steel. "Hey, can you hear me?" The man didn't move. He didn't even blink. I moved to the next door. I looked through the glass. The exact same layout. A small concrete room, a metal chair, and sitting in the chair was another person. A woman this time, dressed in 1970s ski gear. She was just as still as a man, her eyes fixed forward, unblinking. I ran down the hallway, looking into window after window. Every room was occupied. Men, women, teenagers. Some dressed in modern winter clothes. Others in outfits that looked like they belonged in the 1950s, the 1920s, and even earlier. Dozens of people, all frozen in perfect stillness. I reached the end of the corridor. There was a final door, much larger than the others. It wasn't locked. The heavy steel handle turned easily in my grip. I pulled it open and stepped inside. This room wasn't an isolation cell. It was an office. A massive, circular room lined from floor to ceiling with filing cabinets. In the center of the room was a heavy wooden desk covered in stacks of yellow paper. Sitting behind the desk was a man in a sharp, tailored suit from the 1920s. Unlike the others, he wasn't frozen. As I walked in, he looked up from the papers. His eyes were entirely black. No whites, no pupils. Just deep, empty voids. "Ah," he said, his voice smooth and echoing, sounding exactly like the radio static that had mimicked my own voice earlier. The night watchman finally finds the archives. We were wondering when the architecture would guide you down here. I tightened my grip on the steel batten, though I knew it was useless. "Who are you? What is this place?" The man smiled. It was a terrible, stretching smile that showed too many teeth. "This is a foundation, the true Blackwood Estate. The structure above is merely a lure. A beautifully crafted trap designed to catch the curious, the wealthy, and the isolated." He stood up, smoothing his suit jacket. "A building is a living thing, Mr. Watchman. It consumes, it digests, it requires a constant flow of energy to maintain its shape. The people in the cells outside, they are the batteries, caught within the shifting geography of the hotel, preserved perfectly to power the walls, the lights, the heat." "You're insane?" I whispered. "I am a function," the man replied smoothly. "Just as you are. The hotel requires a new caretaker. The old one," he gestured vaguely to the ceiling, "lost his mind when the fourth floor reconfigured itself into an endless loop. He ran into the snow to escape. Tragic waste of a good battery." He stepped out from behind the desk. "You, however, have shown remarkable resilience. You survived the ballroom. You found the root tunnel. You are exactly what the estate needs." The lights in the circular office began to pulse. The filing cabinets vibrated, the drawers rattling aggressively. The man's form began to waver, his sharp suit dissolving into the same geometric, shifting static as a tall shadow from the ballroom. "The shift is beginning," the entity hissed, its voice no longer human, but a chorus of grinding metal and breaking stone. "The estate is hungry, and you are on the menu." The floor beneath my feet violently pitched forward. The floor beneath me didn't just break, it liquefied. The solid concrete turned into a thick, sludgy mass, pulling my boots down like quicksand. I swung the steel batten wildly, striking the edge of the desk, trying to find purchase, but the heavy oak was already sinking alongside me. The entity with the black eyes didn't fall. It simply floated above the dissolving floor, its geometric static form vibrating with that terrible, grinding hum. Then the sludge gave way completely, and I was falling. I hit a steep incline, sliding rapidly down a chute of smooth, freezing stone and pitch darkness. The air rushing past my face smelled of ancient dust and copper. I tumbled, slamming my shoulder against sharp curves, completely at the mercy of the mountain's gravity. I don't know how far I fell. Hundreds of feet, maybe more. Finally, I was thrown out of the chute, landing hard on a metal grate. The impact knocked the wind out of me. I lay there in the dark, gasping, my ribs screaming in protest. As my vision adjusted, a faint, sickly green light flickered to life above me. I was in a massive, cylindrical shaft. The metal grate I was lying on spanned the width of the shaft, but below the grate, there was nothing, just an endless drop into a glowing, green abyss. I rolled over carefully, gripping the rusted metal to steady myself. The entire structure was vibrating with a rhythmic, mechanical pulse. Thump, hiss, thump, hiss. It sounded exactly like a massive lung pulling in air. I found my flashlight lying a few feet away, miraculously intact. I clicked it on. The beam revealed the walls of the shaft were covered in thick, black cables. But as the light washed over them, I realized they weren't cables. They were massive, pulsating veins, slick with condensation, pumping some dark, viscous fluid up toward the higher levels of the hotel. The entity wasn't speaking metaphorically. The building was alive, and I was in its cardiovascular system. I stood up, my legs trembling. Across the grate, about 50 feet away, was a heavy steel door set into the curving wall of the shaft. It was the only way off the grate. As I started to walk toward it, the rhythmic thumping intensified. The metal beneath my boots shuddered. From the darkness above, a massive drop of thick, black fluid fell, hissing as it hit the grate inches from my foot. The metal immediately began to corrode, smoking and bubbling. I broke into a run. More drops fell, splattering the grate, eating through the rusted iron. I reached the steel door, grabbed the handle, and threw my weight into it. It shrieked in protest, but gave way. I dove through the opening, slamming the door shut behind me just as a shower of the corrosive fluid rained down on the grate outside. I leaned against the cold steel, trying to control my breathing. I was in a narrow maintenance corridor. The walls here were lined with old, glass-faced electrical meters. Their needles were jumping wildly, registering power surges that shouldn't have been possible. I started walking down the corridor. The air was dry here, almost completely devoid of moisture, stinging my eyes and throat. About 100 yards down, the corridor took a sharp right turn. I peered around the corner and froze. The hallway opened up into what looked like an underground train station. There was a concrete platform, arched ceilings tiled in dirty white ceramic, and a set of rusted tracks running off into the darkness. But there was no train, just a single solitary wooden bench sitting in the middle of the platform. And sitting on the bench was a duffel bag. I approached it cautiously, sweeping my light across the empty tracks. The silence here was heavy, oppressive. I reached the bench and unzipped the duffel bag. Inside were clothes, a few books, a battery-powered lantern, and a wallet. I opened the wallet and shined my light on the driver's license inside. Arthur Pendleton, the previous winter caretaker, the one who supposedly quit in November and left all his belongings behind. Underneath the clothes was a thick, leather-bound journal. I pulled it out and opened it to the last marked page. The handwriting was erratic, jagged, like it had been written by someone shivering violently. Day 42. The halls are rearranging again. I tried to map the third floor, but the corridors folded back on themselves. I ended up in the basement, without ever taking the stairs. The shadows know I'm watching them. The tall ones. They don't like being observed. If you look at them directly, they freeze, like a quantum mechanics problem. Observation alters their behavior, but the moment you look away, they move faster. The hotel wants me to sleep. The beds look so warm, but I know if I close my eyes, I'll wake up in one of the concrete cells. I found the root system today. The veins. It's pulling power from a fault line. The architect didn't build a resort. He built a parasite. Don't look at the walls when they bleed. Don't let the static voices trick you. And whatever you do, never punch the clock at 3:33 a.m. That's when the feeding cycle begins. I checked my watch. The digital display was violently glitching, flashing random numbers, but the analog hands underneath were steady. They read 3:45 a.m. I had just barely missed the feeding cycle, but the stamp on my punch clock in the ballroom, it had read 3:32 a.m. I had been minutes away from being caught in whatever process the building used to digest its occupants. A sound interrupted my thoughts. A low, wet scraping coming from the tunnel that held the train tracks. It was exactly like the sound the tall shadow had made dragging itself across the ballroom floor. I shoved the journal into my jacket pocket and clicked off my flashlight. I crouched behind the concrete bench, holding my breath. From the mouth of the tunnel, a pale, sickly light began to spill onto the platform. It wasn't emergency lighting. It was bioluminescence. Out of the darkness crawled one of the tall shadows. But down here, without the illusion of the hotel to mask it, its true form was horrifyingly visible. It was a mass of shifting, pale limbs, far too long and thin to be human, wrapped in a translucent, glowing skin that revealed dark, shifting organs underneath. It dragged itself along the tracks, its head completely featureless except for a jagged, vertical slit where a mouth should be. It wasn't alone. Behind it, a second creature crawled into the light, then a third, a hunting pack, the hotel's white blood cells, searching for the infection that had escaped the archive room. They dragged themselves onto the platform. The sound of their damp skin sliding against the ceramic tiles made my stomach churn. I remembered Arthur's journal. If you look at them directly, they freeze. The moment you look away, they move faster. I was completely hidden behind a bench, not looking at them, which meant they were moving at full speed. Suddenly, the scraping stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. They were right on the other side of the concrete bench. I could smell the ozone and decay rolling off them. The vertical slit on the nearest creature's face fluttered open, emitting a low, clicking sound. It sounded like an echolocation pulse. It was hunting blindly, sensing for heat from movement. I closed my eyes and forced myself to remain absolutely, perfectly still. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure they could hear it. The clicking grew louder, faster. The creature was leaning over the top of the bench. A drop of icy, viscous fluid fell from its face and hit the back of my hand. I bit my lip until it bled to keep from screaming. I backed out of the room. A voice whispered from the creature's vertical mouth. My voice, exactly as it had sounded on the radio. My heart hammering against my ribs. They were using my own fear against me, trying to bait me into moving, into running. I kept my eyes shut tightly. I didn't breathe. After what felt like an eternity, the clicking slowed. The scraping sound resumed, moving away from the bench, heading down the opposite tunnel. I waited until the sound faded completely before I dared open my eyes. The platform was empty. The glowing bioluminescence was gone. I let out a shaky breath and stood up. I couldn't stay here. I needed to find a way up. I needed to find the surface. I clicked my flashlight back on and aimed it down the tunnel the creatures hadn't taken. The tracks ended abruptly a few hundred yards down, terminating at a massive set of rusted iron elevator doors. There was no call button, just a heavy wheel in the center of the doors. I grabbed the wheel and strained against the rusted metal. With a deafening screech that echoed down the tunnel, the wheel turned. I pulled the doors apart, hoping the creatures hadn't heard the noise. Inside was a heavy freight elevator, the kind used in old industrial mines. A single bare bulb hung from a wire in the ceiling, providing a dim yellow light. The control panel had no floor numbers, just a heavy lever that could be pushed up or down. I stepped inside, pulled the door shut, and shoved the lever upward. The elevator jerked violently, gears grinding, and began its slow ascent. The shaft walls rolling past the metal grate of the elevator weren't made of rock or concrete. They were lined with the same dark mahogany we'd found in the hotel's luxury suites. But the wood was breathing, expanding and contracting, oozing a dark, sap-like substance. Framed oil paintings hung haphazardly on the shifting wood. Portraits of people from the 1920s, their faces twisted in expressions of absolute terror. Their eyes tracked the elevator as it rose. As we climbed, the temperature began to drop rapidly. The freezing cold of the blizzard above was seeping down. The elevator groaned, the cables snapping and straining. Suddenly, with a massive jolt, the car stopped. The lights flickered and died. I clicked my flashlight on. The lever was jammed. I pushed and pulled, but it wouldn't budge. I shined my light through the grate. We had stopped between floors. The top half of the elevator faced a solid concrete wall. The bottom half faced an open hallway. I had to crawl out on my stomach, squeezing through the narrow gap between the floor of the elevator and the ceiling of the hallway below. I dropped onto the plush, familiar carpet of the hotel. I was back in the east wing of the fourth floor. The air was freezing again. The emergency lighting cast those long, warped shadows. I stood up, gripping my baton. The silence of the hotel had returned. The massive, heavy silence of an empty building in a blizzard. I started walking toward the stairwell. If I could just make it to the lobby, maybe I could smash one of the reinforced windows and brave the storm. Freezing to death in the snow seemed infinitely preferable to whatever the hotel had planned for me. But as I passed room 414, I noticed something. The door was closed, flush with the frame, but painted on the dark wood, in a thick, dark substance that looked like half-dried blood, was a massive arrow. It pointed directly toward the stairwell. I kept walking. The arrow wasn't a warning. It was a direction. The hotel was guiding me. I reached the heavy fire door of the stairwell and pulled it open. Instead of concrete steps leading down to the lobby, the doorway opened into a massive, opulent library. 2 stories of bookshelves packed with leather-bound volumes, connected by spiral iron staircases. In the center of the room was a large mahogany desk. Sitting on the desk was a massive, ancient blueprint. The edges were curled and yellowed with age. I approached the desk, shining my light across the schematic. It was the original architectural plan for the Blackwood Estate, but it wasn't drawn with normal symbols. The layout was a massive, complex geometric sigil. The corridors were designed to channel energy. The rooms were positioned at specific intersection points. The boiler room wasn't just heating the building, it was the heart, pumping the harvested energy through the vein-like cables I had seen in the shaft. And at the bottom of the blueprint, written in elegant, looping cursive, was a note from the architect. To bind the entity to the stone, the structure must be continually fed. The guests provide the ambition. The staff provides the labor. But the caretaker provides the soul of the machine. The cycle must not be broken. The library door slammed shut behind me. The heavy lock clicked into place. I spun around. Standing on the second-floor balcony of the library, looking down at me, were the people from the isolation cells. The man in the winter coat. The woman in the 1970s ski gear. Dozens of them. They weren't frozen anymore. They were moving, walking slowly toward the spiral staircases, descending toward the ground floor. Their eyes were completely black, just like the archivist, and as they walked, their mouths fell open, emitting a low, synchronized hum that resonated in my teeth. It was the sound of the static, the sound of the hotel's hunger. They were blocking the only exit, and they were coming for me. I backed against a heavy mahogany desk, raising my steel baton, knowing it was completely useless against the sheer number of them. The hum grew louder, the library walls vibrating with the sound. The books on the shelves began to shake, falling to the floor with heavy, dusty thuds. The building was closing in. The walls of the library themselves seemed to be creeping forward, shrinking the room, pushing a horde of consumed caretakers closer to me. The geometry of the hotel was finally collapsing its trap. I had the journal in my pocket. I had the blueprint on the desk, but I had nowhere to run. The hum of the possessed caretakers vibrated through the floorboards, creeping up my boots and rattling my teeth. They were moving in perfect synchronization, their black eyes fixed on me, step by dragging step. The room was shrinking. The massive mahogany bookshelves were groaning, literally sliding across the floor, narrowing the circle. The hotel wasn't just going to let them tear me apart. It was going to crush me into the desk, compressing me until I broke, making it easier to drag me down the cells. I looked at the ancient blueprint on the desk, the looping cursive of the architect, the geometric sigils. The hotel was a machine, and a machine requires order. It requires an unbroken circuit. I still had Arthur's duffel bag slung over my shoulder. I plunged my hand inside and grabbed the battery-powered lantern. It was heavy, encased in thick industrial glass and metal. I didn't turn it on. I gripped it by the handle, raised it high above my head, and brought it down with every ounce of strength I had left, right into the center of the mahogany desk. The glass shattered. The heavy metal casing cracked the wood. I brought it down again and again, smashing the lantern into sharp, jagged pieces. But I wasn't aiming for the desk. I was aiming for the battery housing. On the third strike, the lithium battery casing ruptured. A bright, blinding spark erupted, followed instantly by a hiss of chemical heat. I grabbed a handful of the yellowed, dry paper of the architectural blueprint and shoved it directly into the sparking battery fluid. For a second, nothing happened. Then, the ancient paper caught. A pale blue flame licked the edge of the sigil, quickly turning to a violent, hungry orange. The blueprint was easily 90 years old, bone dry, and it went up like a soaked rag. The reaction from the room was immediate and deafening. The synchronism of the caretakers turned into a jagged, piercing shriek. It wasn't coming from their mouths. It was coming from the walls themselves. The hotel was screaming, the possessed figures through their hands over their black eyes, recoiling violently as the light of the fire danced across the library. The fire spread across the desk, catching the heavy wooden surface. The shrinking of the room stopped abruptly. The bookshelves shuddered and froze, the grinding gears of the hotel's geometry jamming in real time. The blueprint curled and blackened, the carefully drawn lines of power dissolving into ash. As the sigil burned away, a massive, sickening crack echoed through the library. The wall directly behind the desk, the solid mahogany paneling, split right down the middle, revealing a dark, raw space between the walls. It wasn't a hallway. It was a negative space. The gap between the hotel's physical architecture and whatever nightmare dimension it used to shift its rooms around. The caretakers were recovering, lowering their hands, the black voids of their eyes locking back onto me. The fire on the desk was growing, the heat searing my face. I didn't have time to think. I scrambled over the burning desk, the flames singeing the fabric of my heavy coat, and dove headfirst into the crack in the wall. I hit the ground hard, tumbling into absolute, suffocating darkness. The air in here was stale, smelling of undisturbed dust and dried rat bones. Behind me, the split of mahogany paneling slammed shut with a final, echoing boom, cutting off the light of fire and the shrieks of the caretakers. I lay there in the pitch black, listening. Nothing. No dragging footsteps. No humming. Just my own rapid, shallow breathing. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my flashlight, praying the fall hadn't broken the bulb. I clicked it on. I was in a crawl space, but it was entirely wrong. The studs and beams weren't made of cut lumber. They were gnarled, twisting roots of dark wood that looked like they had grown naturally into the shape of a building's framework. Thick cables of that pulsing, black vein-like material snaked along the floor and ceiling, throbbing with the slow, steady heartbeat of the estate. I had to crouch to move. The space was barely 3 feet high. I started crawling forward, careful not to touch the pulsing black veins. If this was a negative space, the space between the shifting rooms, then the normal rules of the hotel's layout didn't apply here. This was the backstage. I crawled for what felt like miles. Time doesn't exist in the dark. My knees were bruised, my hands covered in thick, greasy dust. The air grew thinner, colder. Every so often, I would hear sounds bleeding through the walls beside me. The clinking of crystal glasses, a jazz band playing a muffled, distant tune, the heavy, wet sound of a tall shadow dragging itself across the floor just inches from my ear. The hotel was putting on its endless, loop plays in the rooms adjacent to me, trapping echoes of the past to feed its core. Eventually, the gnarled roots opened up into a slightly larger hollow. I could stand up, though my head brushed the ceiling. I swept my flashlight around the space. It was a dead end, but in the corner, resting on a bed of torn insulation and shredded wallpaper, was a sleeping bag. Next to it were empty cans of beans, a dozen dead batteries, and a wall completely covered in charcoal writing. I walked closer, my heart in my throat. This was Arthur's sanctuary, the place he had hidden when the room started shifting. He had found a blind spot in the hotel's anatomy. I aimed my light at the wall. The charcoal writing was frantic, overlapping, spiraling out from the center in chaotic circles. I stepped closer to read it. It can't see the gaps. The architect made the rooms a trap, but he didn't design the spaces in between. The static can't reach here, but the cold does. The cold always does. I found the heart. It's not a metaphor. The boiler room is the stomach. The heart, the lungs. The physical fire masks the unnatural cold of the entity. The valves, the 3 pressure valves. If you close them, the steam has nowhere to go. The physical shell will rupture. If the shell burns, the entity loses its anchor. It will freeze in its own void. I pulled Arthur's journal from my pocket and flipped through the pages I hadn't read yet, comparing it to the wall. The final entries were erratic. Day 50. I'm out of food. The water from the pipes is black. I have to go to the boiler room. I have to shut the valves. If I don't come back, it's because the tall ones found me, or the archivist. God, the archivist. He wears my father's face now. I shouldn't have looked at him. I'm leaving the bag. I'm leaving the book. If someone finds this, finish it. Turn the wheels to the right. Lock them down. Let the pressure build. Let the house burn. Arthur hadn't run away into the snow. He had tried to kill the Blackwood Estate. And judging by the fact that the hotel was still standing, he had failed. I looked at the charcoal, writing one last time. Turn the wheels to the right. Let the house burn. I had a choice. I could stay in this blind spot until I starved to death, or until the cold finally stopped my heart. Or I could follow Arthur's path. I could find the true boiler room, shut the valves, and blow this nightmare off the face of the mountain. I took a deep breath, the stale air burning my lungs, and turned away from the sanctuary. I found a narrow gap in the root-like studs at the back of the hollow. It led sharply downward. I squeezed through, descending deeper into the negative space. The descent was agonizing. The space grew tighter, forcing me to wriggle on my stomach like a worm. The pulsing black veins were everywhere now, slick and warm against my face. The sound of the heartbeat was deafening, a massive, rhythmic thud that vibrated through wood and straight into my skull. As I dragged myself downward, the hotel began to notice I was in its walls. It started with whispers, not to my radio this time, but directly in my ears. "You're a failure," the voice hissed. It sounded like my ex-wife. The exact pitch, the exact tone of disappointment. "You hide in empty buildings because you can't face the real world. You owe money you'll never pay back. You're going to die in the dark, and no one will even notice you're gone." I squeezed my eyes shut and kept crawling. "Shut up," I muttered through gritted teeth. Why fight it? Now the voice changed. It was my father. "It's warm in the cells. It's quiet. You can just sit down. You can just rest. You've been tired for so long, haven't you? Just let the building hold you." I said, "Shut up," I yelled, my voice cracking the confined space. The walls began to constrict. The roots tightened around my shoulders, pressing against my ribs. The hotel was physically squeezing me out, like a splinter being pushed from an infected wound. The pressure was immense. I couldn't expand my chest to breathe. Panic flared white-hot and blinding. I clawed at the wood, kicking my boots frantically against a narrow chute. With a sickening, wet-tearing sound, the wood gave way. I fell forward, crashing through the ceiling of a room, landing violently on a hard concrete floor. My flashlight clattered away, spinning across the room before coming to a halt. I lay on my back, gasping for air, clutching my bruised ribs. The air in this room was different. It was heavy, saturated with the smell of iron, coal dust, and scalding steam. The heat was oppressive, wrapping around me like a wet blanket. I pushed myself up onto my hands and knees and crawled toward my flashlight. I grabbed it and shined it around the room. I was in the basement, the true basement. This wasn't the shifting geometry of the ballroom or the freezing cavern of the archive cells. This was the raw, industrial gut of the Blackwood Estate. Huge iron pipes snaked across the ceiling, wrapped in peeling asbestos insulation. The concrete walls were stained black with decades of soot. And at the far end of the room, standing at least 20 feet tall, were the boilers. They were massive iron beasts, glowing a dull, angry red from the furnaces roaring inside their bellies. The sound was deafening, a continuous, low-frequency roar of burning coal and boiling water. But they weren't just machines. The black, fleshy veins I had seen in the walls were connected directly to the iron, pumping that dark fluid straight into the heating chambers. The boilers were breathing. The metal sides expanded and contracted subtly with every roar of the flames. There, near the top of the massive central boiler, accessed by a rusted metal catwalk, were the 3 pressure valves, heavy iron wheels. Turn the wheels to the right, lock them down. I forced myself to stand. My legs felt like lead, my whole body battered from the fall. I took a step toward the iron catwalk. I wouldn't do that if I were you. The voice cut through the roar of the furnaces. It didn't come from my head. It came from the shadows beneath the catwalk. I swung my flashlight down. Sitting in a rusted metal chair, illuminated by the red glow of the furnace fires, was a man. He was wearing the thick winter coat of a caretaker. His hair was long, matted with grease and ash. His face was gaunt, his skin stretched too tight over his cheekbones. He looked up at me, shielding his eyes from the glare of my flashlight. His eyes weren't black like the archivist or the people in the cells. They were human, bloodshot, terrified, and painfully human. "Arthur?" I croaked. The man offered a weak, trembling smile. "You found my book. I assume that's how you know about the valves." I kept the light on him, my hand hovering over my steel baton. "You're supposed to be dead, or in one of those cells." Arthur let out a dry, hacking laugh that turned into a wet cough. "The cells are for the passive batteries, the ones who just gave up. The hotel needs something stronger to regulate the core. It needs a conscience. It needs a watchman." He slowly unzipped his heavy winter coat and pulled it open. I took a step back, a wave of pure nausea hitting me. Arthur's chest was torn open, the ribcage peeled back like the doors of a cabinet, but there was no blood. Instead, thick clusters of black, pulsing veins were rooted directly into his chest cavity. They writhed and twitched, connected to the massive iron boiler behind him. The hotel wasn't just feeding on him. It had wired him into its nervous system. He was a living, suffering fuse that kept the entity tethered to the physical machinery. "It hurts," Arthur whispered, tears cutting tracks through the soot on his face. "It burns all the time. Every time the heat rises, I feel in my mind. I see the people in the rooms above. I feel them being digested. Arthur, I can cut you down. We can stop this." He shook his head slowly, wincing in agony. "You can't. If I pull these out, I die. And if I die, the hotel loses its regulator. The pressure drops. The entity goes dormant, and it waits for the next poor bastard to take the job. It won't end. It just sleeps." He leaned forward, straining against the fleshy cables holding him to the chair. "But you can take my place." I froze. "What?" Arthur's eyes went wide, pleading, desperate. "Just for a little while. Just until I can rest. The building likes you. It brought you down here instead of digesting you. It wants you. If you take the cables, I can finally die. I can finally be done." "I'm not plugging myself into that thing," I said, backing away toward the catwalk stairs. "I'm shutting the valves. I'm doing what you wrote on the wall." Arthur's expression changed. The desperation vanished, replaced by a cold, flat anger. When he spoke again, his voice was layered with the grinding, static hum of the entity. "You can't shut the valves. If the pressure builds too high, the physical shell breaks. The entity dies. I die. You're already dead, Arthur. Look at yourself." "No!" Arthur screamed, and the roar of the furnaces flared behind him, sinking with his rage. The heavy iron doors of the basement slammed shut, locking from the outside. Arthur's head snapped to the side at a broken, unnatural angle, exactly like the tall shadows in the ballroom. The caretaker must remain. The cycle must not be broken. From the shadows behind the massive boilers, movement caught the edge of my light, the bioluminescent glow of the tall ones. They were crawling down from the ceiling, their impossibly long limbs clicking against the iron pipes. 4 of them, their vertical mouths opening and closing, whispering a chorus of my own voice, Arthur's voice, the archivist's voice. "Take the cables," Arthur commanded, his eyes beginning to darken, the black void bleeding into the whites. "Take the cables or they will tear you apart, piece by piece, and the building will feast on your remains for a century." I looked at the 4 creatures slithering across the pipes. I looked at Arthur, wired into the machine, and I looked up at the rusted catwalk leading to the 3 heavy iron wheels. Turn them to the right, lock them down. I didn't answer Arthur. I didn't try to reason with him. I threw my flashlight directly at the nearest creeping shadow. The heavy metal casing struck it squarely in its featureless face. The creature shrieked, a high-pitched sound of escaping steam, and dropped from the pipe, thrashing on the concrete floor. In the second of distraction, I bolted for the stairs. I hit the rusted metal steps of the catwalk at a dead sprint. The heat, radiating from the boilers, was agonizing. My skin felt like it was blistering beneath my clothes. The metal grate of the catwalk burned through the soles of my boots. Below me, Arthur was screaming. It was a sound of pure, structural agony. "Stop him. Don't let him reach the valves." I reached the platform at the top of the boiler. The 3 wheels were massive, crusted with decades of rust and mineral buildup. I grabbed the first wheel. The iron was searing hot. I screamed as the skin on my palms instantly blistered, but I clamped my hands down tighter and threw my entire body weight into it. With a grinding shriek of protesting metal, the wheel turned. I spun it all the way to the right until it locked. Instantly, the pitch of the furnace changed. A deep, violent shudder ran through the massive iron tank. Steam hissed violently from the seams. I threw myself at the second wheel. The tall shadows were climbing the catwalk structure. I could hear their wet limbs slapping against the metal steps. Long, translucent fingers curled over the edge of the platform behind me. I kicked out blindly, my heavy boot connecting with something soft and yielding. A shriek tore through the air, and a weight vanished from the platform. I grabbed the second wheel. My hands were slick with my own blood and sweat, making it hard to grip. I gritted my teeth, ignoring the agony, and pulled. It stuck. It wouldn't move. It's too late. Arthur's voice boomed from below, amplified by the metal of the room. The heart protects itself. I unclipped the steel batten from my belt. I wedged it between the spokes of the heavy iron wheel, using it as a lever. I pulled back with everything I had. The batten bent under the strain, the steel groaning. For a second, I thought the batten would snap. Then the rust broke. The wheel spun to the right. I locked it down. The boiler let out a sound like a dying animal. A massive geyser of superheated steam erupted from a pipe near the ceiling, filling the upper half of the room with scalding white fog. The pressure gauge needle buried itself deep into the red zone. The metal of the tank began to groan, expanding under the immense, trapped pressure. I spun toward the third and final valve. Standing directly in front of it was a tall shadow. Up close, the bioluminescence was blinding. The creature towered over me, its head scraping the low ceiling above the catwalk. Its vertical slit mouth open and a long, pale tongue, covering what looked like human teeth, unrolled. It reached for me with an arm that stretched too far, its fingers ending in sharp, bony points. I didn't back away. I had nowhere to go. I raised my bent steel batten, ready to swing at the nightmare. Suddenly, the creature froze. The glow beneath its skin dimmed. It convulsed, its head snapping violently backward. Below, on the concrete floor, Arthur was screaming, but it wasn't a scream of anger. It was a scream of rebellion. He was gripping the thick, black veins rooted into his open chest. His hands were smoking as he squeezed the fleshy cables. "Do it!" Arthur roared, his eyes entirely human again, shining with tears and agony. "Turn the wheel!" He violently ripped one of the cables out of his own chest. A fountain of black fluid erupted from his sternum. The tall shadow on the catwalk shrieked in unison with Arthur, falling to its knees, clutching its chest. The entity's control was breaking. Arthur was severing the connection. I didn't waste a second. I dropped the batten, grabbed the third, searing hot iron wheel, and spun it to the right with a savage, desperate pull. It locked into place with a heavy metallic clank. The system was sealed. The silence lasted for exactly 1 second. Then, the true roar began. The pressure inside the massive iron boiler exceeded its physical limits. The thick iron plates began to bulge, the rivets popping like gunshots, ricocheting off the concrete walls. The black vein connected to the tank began to violently combust, catching fire and burning with a blinding, chemical green flame. "Get out!" Arthur yelled over the deafening roar of the dying machine. He was slumped in the chair, bleeding black fluid, laughing hysterically. "Run!" I didn't look back. I scrambled down the shaking, vibrating catwalk. The air was turning to pure steam, boiling my lungs with every breath. I hit the concrete floor and sprinted for the heavy iron doors. The hotel was dying, and it knew it. The walls of the basement began to warp and shift, desperately trying to reconfigure, trying to trap me in an endless loop before the core detonated. The floor pitched violently, but I kept my footing, diving toward the exit. I hit the heavy doors with my shoulder. They burst open, and I tumbled out of the basement, out of the nightmare, and into the freezing, howling wind of the Colorado blizzard. The blast wave hit me before I even registered the sound. It was a solid wall of force that picked me up and threw me 10 feet through the freezing air. I landed hard in waist-deep snow. The breath knocked from my lungs for the second time that night. A fraction of a second later, the sound caught up, a cataclysmic, world-ending roar of detonating iron, pressurized steam, and tearing concrete. I rolled onto my back, gasping, sinking into the powder. The blizzard was howling, whipping ice crystals into my eyes, but it couldn't obscure the sheer scale of the destruction. The rear foundation of the Blackwood Estate had blown completely open. A massive geyser of unnatural, sickly green fire was erupting from the basement level, shooting 100 feet into black, storm-choked sky. The flames didn't behave like normal fire. They writhed and lashed out like wounded tentacles, fighting against the heavy snowfall. The agonizing shrieks of the building were deafening, echoing off the jagged mountain peaks, a chorus of tearing wood and shattering glass that sounded horrifyingly human. The heat radiating from the crater was intense, but it was fading fast. The Colorado winter was rushing in to fill the void. The sweat and condensation, soaking my clothes, began to freeze instantly. My heavy coat, singed and torn from the library fire in the crawl space, stiffened into a rigid shell of ice. I scrambled to my feet, my muscles screaming in protest. My hands, blistered and raw from the iron wheels, throbbed with sickening, localized heat against the sub-zero air. I couldn't stay here. The temperature was 20 below. Hypothermia wouldn't take hours. It would take minutes. The main road was 3 miles away down a winding, treacherous mountain pass, currently buried under 4 feet of snow. Walking it was a death sentence. But I remembered the groundskeeper's schedule. The maintenance garage was located 200 yards east of the main building. Inside was a heavy-duty, treaded snowcat used for plowing the drive in the spring. I turned my back on the burning hotel and started pushing my way through the snowdrifts. It was agonizingly slow. The snow was up to my thighs, heavy and wet. Every step required lifting my leg high, plunging it forward, and dragging my exhausted body behind it. The wind was a physical barrier, shoving me backward, screaming in my ears. But the wind wasn't just screaming. It was whispering. As I crested a small rise, putting a line of thick, snow-draped pine trees between myself and the burning estate, the howling of the blizzard shifted pitch. It layered itself, forming words out of rushing air. You broke the circuit. The voice was massive, echoing from the trees, from the sky, from the frozen ground beneath my boots. It didn't sound like Arthur or my father, or the archivist. It sounded like grinding tectonic plates. It was the voice of the mountain itself. The entity wasn't just confined to the mahogany walls and the iron pipes. The hotel was just its mouth. The property, the land, the rock, that was its body. The warmth is gone. The wind roared, swirling a vortex of snow directly in my path. The cold is coming for you. I put my head down, shielding my face with my frozen arm, and kept pushing forward. 100 yards to go. The outline of the heavy corrugated steel roof of the maintenance garage appeared through the whiteout. Suddenly, the ground beneath my feet violently pitched upward. I fell forward, face first into the snow. I scrambled back, wiping the ice from my eyes. The earth wasn't shaking like an earthquake. It was undulating, moving like a wave rolling beneath a carpet. 10 feet in front of me, the thick layer of snow ruptured. A massive, black root burst from the frozen soil. It was the thickness of a tree trunk, slick with that same dark, viscous fluid I had seen in the basement. It lashed wildly in the air, snapping a mature pine tree in half like a dry twig. Then another root burst from the ground to my left, then another to my right. The entity was dying, its physical anchor in the boiler room destroyed, but was throwing everything it had left in a blind, agonizing tantrum. It was trying to cage me in. I dove to the right, sliding under the sweeping arc of a massive root just as it crashed down into the snow where I had been standing. The impact shook the air. I scrambled on my hands and knees, ignoring the blistering pain in my palms, digging to the snow like a panicked animal. I reached the side of the maintenance garage. It was a heavy, cinder-block structure built to withstand avalanches. I dragged myself along the rough concrete wall, toward the side entry door. A shadow moved in the corner of my vision. I snapped my head around. The blizzard was thick, but I could see them, the tall ones. without the hotel to mask them. They were crawling through the snowdrifts, their bioluminescent glow muted by the storm, turning them into pale, sickly phantoms flitting between the trees. They were moving erratically, their limbs twitching and snapping. The destruction of the core had severed their primary power source, but they were running on residual energy, a dying, desperate hunting pack. I reached the steel door of the garage. I grabbed the handle. It was locked. I slammed my shoulder against it. Solid steel. It didn't budge. I looked back. The tall shadows were closing the distance, their featureless heads snapping back and forth, homing in on the heat of my body. The closest one was 50 feet away, dragging itself over a felled pine tree, its vertical mouth opening to emit a broken, static hiss. I felt around my belt, my numb fingers searching frantically. My keys. I had dropped a physical punch clock, but my heavy keyring, the master set for the entire estate, was still clipped to my belt loop. I ripped it off, my frozen fingers fumbling with the jagged pieces of metal. I couldn't feel the ridges. I couldn't tell which key was which. I shoved one into the lock. It didn't turn. 40 feet. The creature pulled itself out of the snow, rearing up to its full, unnatural height, a jagged silhouette against the storm. I fumbled for the next key, shoved it in, pushed. It wouldn't turn. 30 feet. I could smell the ozone now, cutting through the crisp winter air. Two more of them emerged from a tree line, flanking the first. I grabbed the third key on the ring. It felt slightly thicker, the edges sharper. I jammed it into the cylinder and twisted with a violent, panicked jerk. Click. The heavy deadbolt slid back. I threw the door open, threw myself inside, and slammed the steel shut. I threw the deadbolt, the slide lock, and backed away, gasping for breath. The inside of the garage was pitch black and freezing, but it was dead silent. The thick cinder block walls cut out the howling of the wind entirely. I leaned against a heavy workbench, letting my eyes adjust to the darkness. Thump. A heavy impact hit the steel door, then a wet, sliding sound, like a massive hand smearing against the metal. Let us in. A chorus of voices whispered from the other side of the door. The voices were out of sync, overlapping in a chaotic, terrifying harmony. It's so cold out here. The fire is gone. Let us in. I backed further into the garage. Let them freeze. Without the boiler pumping heat through the veins, they wouldn't last a night. I turned my attention to the garage. The faint moonlight bleeding through the frosted skylights revealed the massive, hulking shape of the snowcat parked in the center of the bay. It was a beautiful, industrial beast. Bright orange heavy metal, thick rubber treads designed to chew through ice, and a reinforced glass cab. I stumbled toward it, my boots echoing on the concrete floor. I grabbed the handle of the driver's side door and pulled. It opened with a heavy click. I climbed inside and slammed the door. The cab was cramped, smelling of diesel fuel and old leather. I reached for the ignition. Empty. No keys. Damn it. I hissed, slamming my bruised hands against the steering wheel. The groundskeeper must have taken them when the staff evacuated. I grabbed my flashlight from my pocket. It flickered weakly. The battery was almost dead, but it cast enough light to see the dashboard. I was a mechanic, but I knew basic hot wiring from my teenage years, pulling repo jobs. I dropped beneath the steering column and yanked the plastic casing off. A mess of colored wires spilled out into my lap. Outside, a massive structural groan echoed through the building. The corrugated steel roof of the garage buckled slightly. Dust and rust rained down onto the windshield of the snowcat. They weren't trying to get through the door anymore. The entity was using the massive roots to crush the garage. I bit down on my flashlight to hold it steady and dug into the wires. I needed the ignition wire and the starter. My fingers were completely numb, clumsy blocks of ice. I stripped the casing off a red wire with my teeth, tasting copper and dirt. I found a thick yellow wire and stripped that one too. The roof buckled again, this time with a deafening screech of tearing metal. One of the massive steel support beams bent sharply in the center, bowing inward toward the cab of the snowcat. A cinder block cracked and fell from the wall, smashing into the concrete floor. I twisted the wires together. The dashboard lit up. The fuel gauge needle slowly climbed to 3/4 full. I grabbed the thick starter wire, my hand shaking violently. Come on. Come on, you bastard. I struck the starter wire against the exposed copper of the ignition. Sparks showered onto my lap. The heavy diesel engine groaned, turning over sluggishly, thick oil resisting the cold. Roar, 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 silence. The engine died. The roof above me tore open. A jagged hole appeared in the corrugated steel, letting the howling blizzard in. Through the gap, I saw one of the massive black roots riding against the storm sky. It slammed down against the edge of the hole, ripping the steel wider like an opener. I struck the wires together again. Faster, harder. Roar, roar, roar. The massive diesel engine caught, erupting with a deafening mechanical bellow that shook the entire cab. Black smoke belched from the exhaust stack. I dropped the wires, grabbed the heavy gear lever, and threw it into drive. I slammed my boot down on the accelerator. The treads caught the concrete floor, shrieking as the massive vehicle lurched forward. I aimed the snowcat directly at the closed, corrugated steel bay doors. I hit the doors at 20 miles an hour. The steel crumpled and blew outward, ripping off the tracks entirely. The snowcat burst out of the garage, launching into the waist-deep snow of the blizzard. I was completely blind. The headlights cut through the whiteout, but all I could see was a wall of swirling snow. I knew the general direction of the access road. East. Keep the mountain peak to my left, keep the lake to my right. The snowcat chewed through the drifts, its massive treads crushing everything beneath them. The heater in the cab roared to life, blasting stale, warm air onto my frozen face. For a single, fleeting second, I felt a surge of triumph. I was out. I was mobile. I was going to make it. Then the ground in front of me tore open. A root the size of a city bus erupted from the snow directly in my path. I wrenched the steering wheel hard to the right. The snowcat tilted violently, the left tread lifting off the ground as we banked, narrowly missing the massive appendage. I looked in the side mirror. The burning ruins of the Blackwood Estate were a towering beacon of green fire in the distance. But the fire was spreading. It was traveling along the root system under the snow, racing toward me. Glowing green fissures cracked across the frozen ground, tracking my path. The entity wasn't letting me go. It was bleeding out, burning from the inside, but it wanted to drag me into the dark with it. I floored the accelerator, pushing the heavy machine to its absolute limit. The engine screamed, the cabin vibrating violently. The trees whipped past the windows, ghostly shapes in the blizzard. You belong to the architecture. The voice boomed over the roar of the diesel engine, vibrating through the glass of the windshield. I navigated a steep drop, the snowcat sliding sideways before the treads caught again. I was close. I had to be close to the main gate. The access road was a straight line from here, lined by massive, ancient oak trees on either side. The headlights caught the first set of oaks. I straightened the wheel, aligning the vehicle to thread the needle down the avenue. But as the headlights washed over the trees, the wood began to twist. The massive oaks, trees that had stood for 200 years, unrooted themselves. The ground tore open as they dragged their heavy trunks across the snow. They were moving, rearranging themselves, interlocking their branches to form a solid, impenetrable wall of wood directly across the access road. The entity was shifting the geometry of the forest, just like it shifted the corridors of the hotel. I hit the brakes, pulling the heavy levers back with everything I had. The treads locked. The snowcat skidded violently, carving a massive trench in the snow. Fishtailing out of control, we slid sideways, hurtling toward the wall of interlocking trees. The impact was bone-shattering. The passenger side of the snowcat slammed into the massive oak trunks. The reinforced glass shattered, showering the cab in sharp shards. The heavy metal frame crumpled inward. My head slammed against the steering wheel, and my vision flashed white. The engine sputtered and died. The heater cut out. The silence of the blizzard rushed back into the cab, accompanied by the hiss of escaping radiator fluid. I lay slumped against the steering wheel, blood dripping from my forehead, blurring my vision. My ears were ringing. I couldn't move my left arm. My shoulder was completely dislocated from the impact. I forced my eyes open. The windshield was gone. The wind was howling through the crushed cab. I had to get out. The fuel line was likely ruptured, and the engine block was smoking. I kicked the driver's side door. It was jammed against the frame. I kicked it again, ignoring the blinding pain in my ribs. On the third kick, the latch broke and the door swung open. I tumbled out of the cab, landing hard on the ice. Ice, not snow. I scrambled backward, wiping the blood from my eyes. The ground beneath me was completely smooth, completely frictionless. The snowcat hadn't just crashed into the trees. It had skidded off the embankment and crashed onto the frozen surface of Blackwood Lake. The lake spanned 3 miles across the eastern edge of the property. The far shore was a boundary line. If I crossed the ice, I was off the estate. I was free. I stood up, clutching my dislocated shoulder, the wind threatening to blow me off my feet. I looked down at the ice. It was pitch black, swept clean of snow by the violent winds coming off the mountain. But as I stared at the surface, a sickly, familiar yellow light flickered to life deep beneath my boots. I froze. The ice was reflecting the stormy sky. It was transparent, and beneath a foot of solid, frozen water, I wasn't looking at the dark depths of a lake. I was looking down into a room. It was a perfect, pristine recreation of the grand ballroom. The mahogany floors, the crystal chandeliers, the velvet chairs. It was fully lit, suspended upside down beneath the ice. The entity hadn't just trapped me on the lake. It had placed the lake on top of its ceiling. A massive, echoing crack resonated through the ice beneath my boots. I looked down. Directly beneath me, standing on the ceiling of the underwater ballroom, was the archivist. He was wearing his sharp 1920 suit, completely untouched by the water. He tilted his head back, his empty black eyes locking onto mine through the ice. He raised a hand and tapped a single finger against the underside of the frozen surface. Another deafening crack echoed across the lake. A spiderweb fracture shot out from beneath my feet, spreading 30 feet in every direction. "The shift is complete," the archivist's voice whispered, bubbling up through cracks in the ice. "Welcome to the basement." The ice beneath my boots shattered completely. The cold didn't hit me. It consumed me. There was no splash, no graceful plunge. 1 second I was standing on solid black ice, and the next, the world gave way beneath my boots, plunging me into a suffocating, freezing abyss. The shock was instantaneous and absolute. My lungs seized, clamping shut as the sub-zero water Blackwood Lake swallowed me whole. Millions of microscopic needles pierced every inch of my skin, driving the air from my chest in a violent, involuntary gasp. I inhaled water. It burned like battery acid, tearing down my throat and flooding my chest. Panic, raw and primal, exploded in my brain. I thrashed blindly, my heavy ice-caked coat dragging me down like an anchor of lead. My left arm was useless, the dislocated shoulder screaming in agony with every chaotic movement of my body. I kicked my boots, trying to orient myself, try to find which way was up to the shattered surface. I opened my eyes. The water wasn't dark. It was illuminated by a warm, golden glow radiating from below me. I stopped thrashing for a fraction of a second, staring down into the impossible depths. Through the freezing, murky water, I saw the grand ballroom of the Blackwood Estate. It was fully lit, suspended upside down in the abyss. I wasn't just looking at it through the ice anymore. I was sinking directly toward it. The massive crystal chandeliers reached up toward me like grasping claws of glass and light. The velvet chairs, the polished mahogany floor. Everything was perfectly in place, defying gravity, existing in a bubble of warm, dry air beneath the lake. I looked up. The hole in the ice where I had fallen through was a jagged, shrinking window of dark, stormy sky, rapidly pulling away from me. I was sinking too fast. My heavy clothes were pulling me down, away from the surface, dragging me straight toward the inverted ceiling of the ballroom. My lungs were screaming, convulsing as they begged for oxygen. My vision began to narrow, a creeping black tunnel closing in on the golden light below. I had seconds before I blacked out entirely. I stopped fighting the weight. I let it pull me. I sank faster, the water rushing past my ears. The inverted ballroom grew massive beneath me. I was hurtling directly toward the center chandelier. The glowing bulbs, the thousands of faceted crystals, were blindingly bright. I reached out with my one good arm, bracing for the impact of hitting solid glass underwater. But I didn't hit glass. The moment my fingertips brushed the highest crystal of the chandelier, the freezing water simply vanished. There was no transition, no splashing surface. 1 millisecond, I was drowning in a pressurized, sub-zero lake, and the next, I was falling through dry, warm air. Gravity violently reversed itself. I was no longer sinking down into the ballroom. I was falling from the floor of the ballroom, plummeting downward toward the ceiling. I crashed hard against the ornate plaster, my bad shoulder taking the brunt of the impact. I heard a sickening pop, followed by a wave of white-hot agony that completely blinded me for a moment. I lay there on the ceiling, coughing violently, vomiting up freezing lake water onto the pristine white plaster. My whole body convulsed, shivering uncontrollably as the freezing wet my clothes clashed with the stifling, dry heat of the room. I rolled onto my back, gasping, pulling glorious, agonizing breaths of air into my burning lungs. I stared up. 30 feet above me was the polished mahogany floor of the grand ballroom. The velvet chairs were bolted to it, hanging upside down. The massive double doors were sealed shut. It was a perfect mirror image cage. The physical shell is dying. A voice echoed to the cavernous space. I dragged my head to the side, walking across the ceiling toward me. His leather shoes clicking against the plaster was the archivist. His 1920s suit was immaculate. He wasn't wet. He hadn't fallen through the ice. He belonged here, but he wasn't stable. The destruction I had caused in the boiler room was taking its toll. Every few steps, the archivist's physical form would violently glitch, his sharp suit tearing into a burst of static geometry before snapping back together. Black fluid was leaking from his eyes, trailing down his pale cheeks and dripping upward, falling toward the mahogany floor above us. "You burn the heart," the archivist said, stopping 10 feet away from me. His voice was no longer smooth. It was layered with the screeching of tearing metal and the roaring of the green fire consuming the basement. The estate is collapsing. The physical tethers are snapping. But you are still inside the boundary. I tried to push myself up, but my left arm was dead weight, screaming with every millimeter of movement. I managed to get onto my knees, my right hand gripping the plaster. "You're done," I coughed, spitting a mixture of lake water and blood. "The building is burning. Your batteries are dead." The archivist tilted his head. The movement was jerky, mechanical. "A building is just a shell. A hermit crab wears a shell until it outgrows it, or until it breaks. The entity is older than the wood and the iron. It is the mountain. It is the cold. And it is very, very angry." He took another step toward me. As he moved, the golden light of the chandeliers above us flickered and dimmed. The air pressure in the room dropped instantly, popping my ears. "If the shell must die," the archivist whispered, his black eyes widening until they seemed to swallow his entire face, "then the core must retreat. It must pull everything it has consumed into the deep rock, into the permanent dark. And you are coming with us." He lunged. He didn't run. He blurred, crossing the 10 feet between us in a fraction of a second. His hand, cold as liquid nitrogen, clamped around my throat. He lifted me off the ceiling with impossible strength, holding me suspended in the air. My feet kicked uselessly. His grip was a vise of solid iron. The cold radiating from his skin seeped directly into my veins, freezing my blood, slowing my heart rate almost instantly. "Sleep, watchman," the archivist hissed, his face inches from mine. The smell coming off his breath was pure decay, rotting earth and stagnant water. "Be digested." My vision began to gray out. I couldn't pry his fingers loose with my one good hand. I was suffocating, freezing to death from the inside out, but my right hand wasn't entirely empty. When I had fallen, I had instinctively reached out, and my fingers had curled around something hard and sharp, a piece of the shattered plaster from my impact. As the darkness closed in, I gripped the jagged shard of plaster. I didn't swing wildly. I brought my arm up, aiming for the only part of him that looked human. I drove the sharp plaster directly into his pitch-black eye. The archivist let out a sound that defied description, a localized sonic boom of pure static and shrieking feedback. His grip vanished. I dropped back to the ceiling, gasping, clutching my bruised throat. The archivist stumbled backward, clutching his face. He wasn't bleeding blood. A torrent of blinding, bioluminescent green light was pouring out of the wound, illuminating the inverted ballroom like a flare. His physical form was completely breaking down. His suit dissolved into a swarm of shifting geometric shapes. His remaining eyes stared at me with pure, unadulterated hatred. "You cannot escape the digestion," the entity roared through him, the voice shattering two of the massive chandeliers hanging above us. Massive shards of crystal rained down, or rather, fell up, crashing into the ceiling around me. One piece, the size of a dagger, embedded itself into the plaster inches from my leg. The archivist threw his arms wide. The plaster ceiling beneath me began to shudder violently. Fissures spiderwebbed outward from where he stood. If we fall together. The ceiling cracked open. A massive fissure, 10 feet wide, tore through the center of the room. The archivist didn't fall. He dissolved completely, turning into a cloud of black ash that was instantly sucked down into the expanding chasm. I scrambled backward, kicking my boots against the plaster, desperately trying to get away from the edge. But the structural integrity of the room was gone. The plaster crumbled beneath my hands. I slipped, sliding toward the dark, jagged tear in the ceiling. I grabbed the embedded shard of crystal chandelier with my right hand, my fingers wrapping tightly around the sharp edges. It sliced into my palm, but it held. I dangled over the edge of the fissure, my boots kicking empty air. I looked down into the chasm. It wasn't a drop into dirt or rock. It was a drop into a chaotic, swirling vortex of memories. I could see rooms flying past each other in the void, a fragment of the 1920s dining room, a slice of a 1970s hotel room, a chunk of the industrial kitchen. The entity's mind was fracturing, its digested history spinning out of control as it died. And from deep within the vortex, a massive, unnatural suction began to pull at me. It was a psychic gravity, trying to drag me down into collective nightmare of everyone who had ever died in the Blackwood Estate. The plaster around my crystal anchor began to crack. "No!" I grunted, blood dripping from my cut hand down my arm. I swung my legs, desperately searching for a foothold on the jagged edge of the fissure. My boot caught a piece of exposed wooden lath. I pushed up with my legs, pulling with every ounce of strength in my right arm. My dislocated left shoulder dragged against the edge, a blinding flare of pain making me scream out loud. I threw my center of gravity forward and rolled onto the stable section of the ceiling. I lay there, chest heaving, listening to the roaring vortex inches from my feet. But I wasn't safe. The inverted ballroom was changing. Above me, the mahogany floor began to warp and bubble. The velvet chairs sank into the wood, as if it were mud. The massive double doors melted. The entity was abandoning the space, dissolving the architecture to redirect its remaining power to the deep roots. As the floor melted, a new sound cut through the chaos. The rushing, heavy roar of moving water. The lake, by destroying the archivist and breaking the structural stability of the pocket dimension. The barrier holding back Blackwood Lake was failing. From the melting mahogany floor above, freezing black water began to pour through the gaps, raining down on me in heavy, crushing sheets. The water didn't obey the inverted gravity anymore. It was falling straight down, filling the ceiling like a bowl. I scrambled to my feet. The water was already ankle deep and rising fast. The cold was paralyzing, instantly sapping the warmth I had managed to recover. If the ceiling filled, I would drown in the dark. I looked around the collapsing room. Most of it was dissolving into the memory vortex, but the far corner of the ceiling was still solid and set into the plaster. Something that shouldn't be there, a heavy, rusted iron grate, a ventilation shaft. I waded through the rising water, my legs feeling like blocks of wood. The freezing lake was pouring in faster now, knee-deep by the time I reached the grate. I dropped to my knees, submerging my right arm in the freezing water, and grabbed the iron bars. I pulled. The rust held tight. The water rose to my waist. The roar of the flooding lake was deafening. I pulled harder, screaming through my teeth, the muscles in my back tearing. With a screech of giving metal, the grate ripped free. The water immediately created a whirlpool, sucking down into the dark, vertical shaft. I didn't hesitate. I dove in after it. I was flushed down the narrow metal tube, riding a torrent of freezing water. The walls of the shaft were slick, with a mixture of slime and rust. I spun uncontrollably, the water muffling my screams as I was violently thrown back and forth against the metal. The ride lasted for what felt like an eternity, plummeting deeper and deeper into the bedrock. Just as my lungs began to burn for air again, the shaft angled sharply, slowing my descent, and then abruptly spat me out. I flew through the air and crashed onto a hard, dry surface. The water from the shaft poured out behind me, cascading over the edge of the balcony and vanishing into darkness. I lay on my side, coughing up water, my whole body trembling violently. I was in the advanced stages of hypothermia. My fingers were blue, my lips numb. My brain felt sluggish, thoughts moving like thick syrup. I forced myself to sit up and look at my new surroundings. I was sitting on a lavish, carpeted balcony overlooking a massive, opulent theater. The architecture was stunning, perfectly preserved from the roaring 20s. Red velvet curtains draped the stage, gold leaf trimmed the balconies, and a massive crystal chandelier, intact and glowing with warm light, hung from the frescoed ceiling. It was warm here, unnaturally warm, like a humid summer night. I dragged myself away from the edge of the balcony, leaning against the plush red velvet wall. The contrast was mind-breaking. I was freezing to death, but the air around me was stifling. I looked down at the theater floor. It wasn't empty. The seats were filled. Hundreds of people, dressed in tuxedos, flapper dresses, and silk suits, sat perfectly still, staring at the closed red curtains of the stage. They were transparent, glowing with a faint, ghostly luminescence. Memories. I had fallen out of the physical trap and directly into the entity's digested history. This was the archive of its favorite meals. The height of the Blackwood Estate's glory, preserved forever in a psychic loop. Soft, muffled jazz music began to play from unseen speakers. The sound of a stand-up bass, a slow, mournful trumpet, and the light brush of a snare drum filled the theater. The people in the seats began to move, not quickly, but with a slow, agonizing fluidity, as if moving through heavy water. They turned their heads toward each other, their mouths opening in silent conversation, pantomiming a grand night out. I pressed myself harder against the wall, trying to make myself invisible. If Arthur's journal was right, the entity's immune system would hunt down anything that didn't belong. I was a foreign object in a pristine, preserved memory. Then the jazz music skipped. Like a scratched vinyl record, the trumpet note caught, repeating in a rapid, stuttering loop. The elegant, slow movements of the ghostly audience froze. Slowly, in perfect synchronization, all 300 heads in the theater turned to look up at the balcony. They were looking directly at me. Their faces were beautiful, flawless relics of the past. But as they stared at me, their expressions began to change. The polite smiles dropped, their jaws unhinged, dropping unnaturally low, revealing black, bottomless voids inside their mouths. Their eyes rolled back, exposing slick, white orbs. The jazz music distorted, warping into a deep, grinding industrial hum. They weren't just memories. They were the digested souls trapped in the entity's stomach, and they were starving. The audience stood up in unison. They turned their backs on the stage and began to surge toward the aisles, their transparent hands reaching up toward the balcony. I scrambled to my feet, my legs shaking so badly I almost collapsed. I turned away from the railing and limped toward the double doors at the back of the balcony. I pushed them open and stumbled into a wide, carpeted hallway. The hallway stretched endlessly in both directions, lined with identical oak doors with brass numbers. It looked exactly like the fourth-floor corridor where everything had started. I started running to the right, dragging my useless left arm. The heavy, muffled sound of hundreds of footsteps echoed behind me. The ghosts were climbing the stairs to the balcony. They were coming. I tried the first door I passed. Locked. I tried the second. Locked. Help us. A chorus of hundreds of voices wailed, drifting down the hallway. It sounded like the wind, but filled with profound, terrifying grief. Share the warmth. Share the blood. The temperature in the hallway was dropping rapidly. As the ghosts approached, they were draining the ambient heat from the memory construct. Frost began to spiderweb across the floral wallpaper. The glowing sconces flickered and dimmed. I kept running, my breath pluming in white clouds in front of me. The pain in my shoulder was a dull, constant roar, blending with the agonizing cold in my bones. I looked over my shoulder. A tidal wave of transparent, glowing figures was rounding the corner, filling the entire width of the hallway. They weren't running. They were gliding, sweeping forward like a fog bank of pure, hungry sorrow. I faced forward, desperate. The hallway was perfectly constructed. No cracks, no flaws. It can't see the gaps. Arthur's charcoal writing flashed in my mind. Look for the imperfections. This was a memory of the 1920s. The entity had built this space based on what it remembered digesting. But it was a machine, a parasite. It wasn't perfect. It made mistakes when it tried to rebuild human spaces. I scanned the walls as I ran, searching for anything anachronistic, anything that didn't belong in a 1920s luxury resort. Nothing. Brass sconces, floral wallpaper, oak doors, thick wool runner rug. The ghost wave was 30 feet behind me. The cold radiating from them was so intense the carpet beneath my boots began to crackle with ice. Then I saw it. 50 feet ahead, mounted on the wall between two oak doors, was a bright red, modern plastic fire alarm pole station, complete with a white strobe light. It was a modern addition to the physical hotel, something installed decades after the 1920s, bleeding over into the entity's poorly reconstructed memory loop. A gap. I sprinted for the red plastic box, my lungs burning, my vision spotting with black. The wailing of the ghost was right behind me. I could feel the unnatural, freezing touch of a transparent hand brush against the back of my neck. I reached the wall. I didn't pull the alarm. I drew back my right elbow, braced my feet, and drove my heavy, steel-toed boot directly into the wall just below the plastic box. The entity hadn't fully rendered this part of the memory because it didn't understand the modern technology. The wall was thin, brittle. My boot smashed through the floral wallpaper and the plaster, breaking into an empty, black void behind it. I kicked again, widening the hole, tearing the wooden lath away with my bare hand. The ghosts were upon me. A dozen freezing hands grabbed my coat, my hair, pulling me backward. The cold was instantly paralyzing. My heart stuttered, struggling to beat against the sheer, supernatural chill of hundreds of digested souls. I threw myself forward, diving headfirst into the jagged hole I had kicked in the wall. The transparent hands lost their grip as I slipped through the boundary of the memory. I tumbled through the dark, rolling across a hard, uneven surface. Behind me, the hole in the wall sealed itself with a sound like a zipper closing, cutting off the wails of the ghosts and the freezing aura of the memory loop. I lay in the darkness, panting, completely exhausted. Every muscle in my body was twitching. I was alive. I had found another negative space. I reached into my pocket, praying my flashlight hadn't been crushed in the fall. I pulled it out and clicked the button. The beam was weak, the battery almost entirely drained, casting a dim, sickly yellow cone of light. I swept the beam around my new location. I wasn't in a crawl space or a root system or a boiler room. I was standing in a massive, perfectly spherical chamber carved entirely out of solid, dark rock. The walls were incredibly smooth, as if polished by glass, but they weren't entirely bare, carved into stone, covering every square inch of spherical room, with the geometric sigils from the architect's blueprint, millions of them, intricate, overlapping, spiraling patterns of power and containment. This wasn't a memory. This wasn't the physical hotel. I had fallen into the true core, the anchor point, the place where the original architect had bound the mountain's entity to the stone. In the exact center of the room, sitting on a raised dais of black basalt, was a heavy, iron lockbox. It was the size of a coffin wrapped in thick, rusted chains, secured with massive, ancient padlock. The box was vibrating. It wasn't a mechanical vibration. It was a rhythmic, agonizing thud, like a terrified, trapped heart beating against iron ribs. I stood up slowly, keeping my dim flashlight trained on the box. The air in the spherical chamber was heavy, charged with static electricity that made the hair on my arms stand straight up. "The cycle must not be broken," a voice whispered. It didn't echo from the walls. It didn't come from the box. It spoke directly into the center of my brain. A voice so old, so vast, it felt like the weight of the mountain pressing down on my skull. I took a step backward toward the wall where I had entered, but there was no hole. The smooth, carved rock was unbroken behind me. The physical shell burns. The voice boomed in my mind, dropping me to my knees with the sheer force of sound. The regulators are dead. The blood runs cold. I am untethered, but I am hungry. The heavy, rusted chains wrapped around the iron coffin began to groan, straining against the lock. You broke the circuit. You killed the watchman. You killed the archivist. You owe a debt to the architecture. I clamped my hand over my ears, squeezing my eyes shut. I don't owe you anything. I screamed into the empty stone room. You're a parasite. The padlock on the coffin shattered. It didn't open. It exploded into shrapnel. The heavy chain slithered off the iron box, hitting the stone floor with a deafening crash. The lid of the iron box slowly, agonizingly, began to creak open. A thick, black fog began to spill over the edge of the iron, cascading down the basalt dais and creeping across the smooth stone floor toward me. The fog smelled of ozone, burnt blood, and ancient, stagnant water. I scrambled backward until my back hit the curved stone wall. I was trapped. There were no gaps here, no modern imperfections. This was the absolute foundation of the nightmare. A new core is required. The entity's voice vibrated to the stone at my back. A new heart to pump the rot. A new mind to hold the memories. From the thick black fog pouring out of the box, something began to rise. It wasn't a tall shadow. It wasn't the archivist. It wasn't a possessed caretaker. It was a mass of pure, shifting geometry. Thousands of jagged, obsidian black shards, floating and rotating around a central, blinding core of pale green light. It defied physical laws, folding in on itself, expanding and contracting like a breathing fractal. It was beautiful. It was terrifying. It was the entity itself, stripped of all its human disguises and architectural shells. The geometric mass floated off the dais, drifting across the room toward me. As it moved, the sigils carved into the walls began to glow with a sickly, responding green light. "Do not fight the digestion," the entity commanded, its voice shredding my remaining willpower. "Become the foundation. Become the estate." The shards of obsidian began to separate, spinning faster and faster around the green core, forming a swirling vortex of sharp black glass. It was preparing to envelop me, to strip my mind and wire my soul into the mountain bedrock. I pressed myself against the wall, my breathing ragged, my vision blurring from the cold and the pain. I had survived the freezing lake, the boiling steam, the inverted gravity, and the starving ghosts. But I couldn't fight a god in a box. I looked down at my hand. I was still holding the dying flashlight. A desperate, insane thought cut through my panic. The architect used physical sigils to bind a non-physical entity. He used energy, heat, and circuits to keep it trapped. The entity fed on power to manifest. I looked at the massive, glowing sigils carved into the curved wall beside me. They were channeling the entity's power, keeping the spherical room stable. I didn't try to run from the swirling vortex of obsidian shards. Instead, I turned my back to the entity. I raised a heavy metal flashlight. "You want a new circuit?" I yelled, my voice cracking. "Take this one." I brought the heavy metal end of the flashlight down onto the glowing green sigil carved into the stone wall. I hit it with everything I had left. The flashlight casing shattered. The weak battery sparked against the ancient, carved rock. It wasn't a lot of power, just a tiny, dying jolt of alkaline electricity. But it was foreign energy. It was a chaotic, modern spark introduced directly into a closed, perfectly balanced mystical circuit. The reaction was instantaneous. The green light of the sigil flared blindingly white, hissing as the short circuit rippled through the carved lines. The feedback loop was immediate. The glowing lines on the walls began to snap and pop, traveling around the spherical room at the speed of light. The entity stopped its advance. The swirling obsidian shards froze in midair. "What have you done?" The voice roared in my mind, a tone of absolute, cosmic panic replacing the ancient arrogance. The white-hot feedback loop reached the basalt dais in the center of the room. It struck the iron coffin. The iron didn't just explode, it imploded. The containment field that had held the entity for a century violently collapsed inward. The geometric mass of the entity shrieked, a sound that shattered my eardrums and brought me to my knees. The pale green core at the center of the shards flared like a dying sun, and then was sucked violently backward into the imploding iron box. The gravitational pull of the collapse was immense. The air in the room was sucked into the center. My coat whipped around me as I flattened myself against the wall, digging my fingers into the carved rock to keep from being pulled into the void. The entity fought the pull, its obsidian shards clawing at the air, but the broken circuit was too strong. It was being dragged down into a singularity of its own making. With a final, world-ending scream that shook the very bedrock of the mountain, the green core vanished into the box. The implosion snapped shut. The shock wave blasted outward, a concussive ring of silent force that hit me like a freight train. I was thrown backward, but the stone wall behind me was no longer there. The collapse of the containment field had shattered the physical integrity of the core chamber. I blasted through the stone, tumbling wildly through empty air. I was falling again, but not through water and not through memories. I was falling through blinding, freezing white light. I hit the ground, sliding face first across a rough, icy surface. I lay there, completely still, waiting for the shadows or the ghosts or the archivist. Nothing, just the howling of wind. I slowly, painfully opened my eyes. I was lying on my back on the edge of a massive, jagged cliff. The sky above me was a pale, pre-dawn gray, the storm having finally broken. The air was brutally cold, but it felt clean. It didn't smell like ozone or blood. It smelled like pine needles and fresh snow. I pushed myself up onto my elbows. I was on the far side of Blackwood Lake. I had crossed the boundary line. I turned my head and looked back across the expanse of frozen water toward the estate. There was no towering mahogany resort. There were no glowing green fires. The Blackwood Estate was gone. Where the massive, sprawling luxury hotel had stood for a century, there was only a massive, smoking crater in the side of the mountain. The earth had swallowed it entirely, burying the broken iron boilers, the isolation cells, and the memory loops under thousands of tons of collapsed rock and snow. The entity was buried, trapped beneath a mountain that was no longer its weapon, but its tomb. I let out a ragged, freezing breath, my head dropping back against the snow. My body was broken, my mind fractured, but the static in my head was gone. The quiet of the Colorado morning was the loudest, most beautiful sound I had ever heard. I lay there for a long time, watching the sun slowly crest over the jagged peaks, painting the snow in shades of gold and pale pink. I knew I still had to walk the 3 miles down the access road to the highway. I knew I had a dislocated shoulder, hypothermia, and a story no one would ever believe. But as I finally forced myself to stand, bracing my good arm against a snow-draped pine tree, I noticed something lying in the snow a few feet away. It was the heavy leather journal, Arthur's journal. It had survived the lake, the inverted ballroom, and the collapse of the core. I walked over and picked it up. The leather was freezing, stiff with ice, but intact. I shoved it deep into my coat pocket. The first rule they teach you about guarding an empty building is that no building is ever truly empty. I used to think that meant settling concrete and drafty pipes. Now I know the truth. Buildings remember. The earth remembers. And sometimes, if you walk the halls at exactly the right time, in exactly the wrong place, you might just find out what they're trying to forget. I turned away from the smoking crater and began the long walk down the mountain, leaving the silence of the dark behind me. The 3 miles down the mountain pass felt longer than the 10 years I had spent walking the empty corridors of corporate high-rises. Every step was a negotiation with my own failing body. My left arm hung uselessly at my side, a dead, throbbing weight that sent nauseating waves of agony radiating through my chest every time my boots broke through the crust of the snow. The adrenaline that had propelled me out of the collapsing core was entirely gone, leaving behind a hollow, freezing exhaustion so profound it felt like a physical weight pressing down on my skull. The storm had broken, leaving behind a sky the color of bruised iron. The world was utterly, terrifyingly silent. No wind, no shifting ice, no voices bleeding out of the static. Just a wet, agonizing crunch of my boots dragging through the powder. I don't remember the last mile. My brain simply stopped recording the trauma. My vision had narrowed to a tiny gray tunnel, focusing only on the patch of snow directly in front of my feet. I was hallucinating. I kept seeing the sharp, polished tips of the archivist's leather shoes walking just ahead of me, leading me deeper into the woods. I kept hearing the muted, stuttering jazz music playing from behind the snow-draped pines. But every time I stopped and blinked, the illusions vanished, leaving me alone in the freezing wilderness. I didn't find the highway. The highway found me. I was face down in a snowbank, my cheek resting against the ice, my eyes heavy and begging for sleep. I was ready to give up. The hotel hadn't killed me, but the mountain was going to finish the job. The cold had stopped hurting and had transitioned into a warm, deceptive blanket. Then, a sound cut through the silence. A heavy mechanical grinding. A brutal yellow light swept over the snowbank, blinding me. I forced my head up. Looming out of the gray morning mist was a massive county salt truck, its heavy plow throwing waves of dirty brown slush to the side of the asphalt. I didn't have the strength to yell. I didn't even have the strength to wave my good arm. I just lay there on the edge of the embankment as the massive truck ground to a halt, its air brakes hissing violently. The door swung open, and a man in a heavy neon orange parka jumped down, his boots hitting the slush. I remember him running toward me. I remember the shock on his face, the way his eyes widened as he took in the state of my clothes, the blood frozen to my forehead, and the unnatural angle of my shoulder. I remember him pulling me up, his grip painfully tight, but impossibly warm, and dragging me into the cab of the truck. The heat inside the cab hit me like a physical blow. The smell of stale coffee, diesel fuel, and cheap tobacco was the most beautiful, intoxicating scent I had ever inhaled. It was the smell of the real world. A world where buildings were just concrete and wood, where the shadows were just an absence of light. Holy hell! Buddy, where'd you come from? The driver shouted, cranking the heater dial to maximum and grabbing his dispatch radio. Dispatch, this is Unit 4. I need an ambulance up on the North Pass. I got a guy out here half frozen to death. Looks like he took a bad fall. I slumped against the passenger window, my teeth chattering so violently I thought they would crack. I looked at the driver, trying to form words, trying to tell him not to go near the crater, not to look at the lake, but my jaw wouldn't work. I reached into my frozen coat with my good hand, feeling the heavy, solid rectangle of Arthur's journal pressing against my ribs. It was still there. I hadn't imagined it. I closed my eyes, and for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, I let the darkness take me. And this time, there were no monsters waiting in the void. When I woke up, the world was blindingly white. For a terrifying second, my heart seized, convinced I was back in the blizzard, or worse, back in the wide-out corridors of the shifting hotel. But then the sharp, sterile smell of antiseptic hit my nose, followed by the rhythmic, electronic beep of a heart monitor. I blinked against the harsh fluorescent lights. I was in a hospital bed. I was wearing a thin cotton gown, wrapped in 3 layers of heated blankets. My left arm was immobilized in a heavy sling, strapped tightly to my chest, and 4 lines ran into the back of my right hand. I tried to sit up, but my muscles completely refused to fire. I let out a dry, raspy groan. Take it easy. You're safe. I turned my head. Sitting in a plastic chair in the corner of the small hospital room was a man in a tan uniform, a county sheriff. He was holding a styrofoam cup of coffee, looking at me with a mixture of professional curiosity and deep concern. You've been out for 2 days, the sheriff said, setting the coffee down and pulling his chair closer to the bed. Docs say you had severe hypothermia, a dislocated shoulder, 3 fractured ribs, and minor frostbite on your hands and face. You're lucky Unit 4 was running the early route. Another hour out there, and we'd be having a very different kind of conversation. I swallowed, my throat feeling like it was lined with sandpaper. The hotel? I croaked, my voice barely a whisper. Did anyone go up to the hotel? The crater, the fire? The sheriff frowned, pulling a small notepad from his breast pocket. That's what I'm here to talk to you about. We ran your prints while you were unconscious. You're a long way from home. The plows found your car parked at the bottom of the pass, buried under 3 feet of snow. What the hell were you doing wandering around up there in a blizzard? We have avalanche warnings posted all over the valley. I wasn't wandering. I said, my frustration fighting through the exhaustion. I was working. I was the winter caretaker for the Blackwood Estate, the luxury resort 50 miles up the pass. There was an explosion. The boilers went critical. The whole place collapsed into the mountain. The sheriff stopped writing. He looked up at me, his expression hardening. The pity in his eyes was replaced by something else. Suspicion, or maybe concern for my sanity. Son, the sheriff said slowly, his voice dropping an octave. I've lived in this county for 55 years. My father was a sheriff before me. I know every inch of that mountain. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. There is no resort up there. The Blackwood Estate burned to the ground in 1928. A massive structural fire killed the architect, the staff, and over 200 guests. It was the worst tragedy in the history of the state. Nobody ever rebuilt. The land is cursed, as far as the locals are concerned. The only thing up there at the top of that pass is a massive blackened sinkhole surrounded by overgrown pines and a frozen lake. The rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor spiked. No, I whispered, my mind rejecting the words. No, I lived there for 3 weeks. I ate in the kitchen. I walked the halls. I watched the monitors. The mahogany, the chandeliers, the ballrooms. It was real. I touched it. The sheriff shook his head sympathetically. Hypothermia does terrible things to the brain. It causes hallucinations, delusions. Your mind was probably trying to construct a narrative to keep you awake. You were found wandering 2 miles from the old ruins. You probably fell into the sinkhole, dislocated your shoulder, and crawled your way back toward the road. I was hired. I insisted, my voice rising, bordering on a panic shout. I signed a contract. An agency in Denver gave me the keys. I have the keys. I looked frantically around the room, searching for my clothes. They were folded in a clear plastic evidence bag on a chair near the door. The heavy, frozen coat. The boots. The agency you mentioned in your delirium when the paramedics brought you in, the sheriff said calmly. We looked into it. It's a shell company, registered to a post office box that hasn't been opened in 30 years. We're still investigating who owned the car you were driving, but the title is completely fabricated. He stood up, adjusting his belt. Look, you've been through a massive trauma. I'm not here to press charges for trespassing on state land. The doctors are going to keep you for another week for observation and physical therapy. Get some rest. Stop worrying about ghost stories. You survived. That's all that matters. The sheriff turned and walked out of the room, the heavy wooden door clicking shut behind him. I lay frozen in the hospital bed, staring blindly at the acoustic ceiling tiles. The hotel had burned down in 1928, nearly 100 years ago. The grand ballroom, the luxury suites, the massive industrial kitchen. None of it had been real physical matter. The entity hadn't just haunted a building. It had projected an entire massive physical environment. It had constructed a solid, tactile, functioning illusion out of the memories of the hundreds of people who died in the original fire. It layered its trap directly over the ancient ruins. I had been walking the halls of a ghost, eating phantom food, punching a physical clock into a machine that hadn't existed for a century. The boiler room I destroyed wasn't the original iron of the hotel. It was the psychic anchor the entity used to ground an illusion to the mountain. When I introduced the chaotic energy of the flashlight battery into the true containment room, I didn't blow up a building. I shattered the psychic projection. I was guarding an empty crater, and the entity was feeding off my belief, my routine, my very presence, using me as a battery to keep the projection stable. My breathing grew shallow, my heart racing as the sheer scale of the deception crashed over me. I looked over at the chair by the door. Inside the clear plastic bag, sitting on top of my shredded, blood-stained winter coat, was Arthur's leather-bound journal. The sheriff hadn't mentioned it. To him, it was just a wet, ruined book belonging to a confused hiker. But I knew what was inside. It took me 4 days to convince the doctors I was stable enough to leave. I lied. I smiled. I did the physical therapy. I ate the terrible hospital food. And I played the role of the grateful, recovering survivor who had accepted that his hypothermic brain had played tricks on him. On the 5th day, I walked out of hospital, my left arm still in a sling, wearing a set of cheap sweatpants and a hoodie the nursing staff had donated from the lost and found. My wallet had survived in my coat pocket, the cash inside still perfectly dry thanks to a Ziploc bag. I didn't go back to Denver. I didn't try to track down the fake agency. I knew it would lead to a dead end. Instead, I walked 3 blocks down the street from the hospital and rented a room in a rundown, roadside motel. It was dingy, smelling of old smoke and bleach, with a flickering neon sign outside that cast a sickly red glow through the thin curtains. It was perfect. It was real. It was exactly the kind of cheap, physical reality I desperately needed. I locked the deadbolt, chained the door, and sat down at the small, wobbly laminate desk in the corner. I pulled Arthur's journal from my pocket. The leather was stiff, the pages warped and crinkled from the lake water, but the ink had held. I turned on the small desk lamp and opened the book. I skipped past the frantic entries about the shifting hallways. I bypassed the drawings of the tall shadows and the frantic ramblings about the archivist. I turned to the very end of the journal, to the pages Arthur had written while hiding in the negative space, right before he surrendered himself to the boiler room. The writing here wasn't charcoal. It was etched in dark, dried blood. Arthur had run out of ink, and he had wanted to make sure this information survived. The architect didn't make a mistake. The blood-written text began. He didn't accidentally build on top of a cursed mountain. He was part of the Circle, a society of masons, occultists, and industry barons in the 1920s. They discovered that human ambition, human misery, and human terror generate an energy that can be harvested. But the entities that feed on this energy are wild. They are cosmic storms. They cannot be controlled, only contained. I leaned closer, the red neon light from the window washing over the page. The architect built the Blackwood Estate as a prison, yes, but it wasn't meant to keep the entity away from us. It was meant to concentrate the entity's power. By feeding it a constant stream of wealthy guests and isolated staff, the society could siphon the residual energy off the top. They used it to build their empires, to fuel their own unnatural longevity. The tragedy of 1928 wasn't an accident. It was a massive, deliberate sacrifice, a down payment to keep the entity docile and anchored to the crater. My stomach churned. The entity I had fought wasn't just a monster. It was a victim of its own nature, trapped and utilized by something even darker. Human greed. I turned the page. The final entry was accompanied by a hand-drawn map of the United States. Blackwood was the prototype, Arthur wrote, but it wasn't the only one. The architect designed a grid, a network of containment structures built on natural intersections of power to harvest different flavors of human suffering. They are all designed with the same shifting geometry. They all require a caretaker to maintain the core. There were 5 red X's marked on the map. One was in the mountains of Colorado, the Blackwood Estate. Another was located on a jagged peninsula in Maine. The notes beside it read, the Blackwood Lighthouse, 1932, feeding on isolation and madness. A third was marked in the dense, suffocating swamps of Louisiana, the Blackwood Sanatorium, 1935, feeding on disease and despair. A fourth was deep underground in the forgotten subway tunnels of New York City, the Blackwood Terminus, 1929, feeding on claustrophobia and the rush of the masses. And the final X was in the desolate, sweeping deserts of New Mexico, the Blackwood Penitentiary, 1940, feeding on violence and confinement. I stared at the map. 5 nodes, 5 massive, psychic engines disguised as decaying architecture, quietly feeding in the dark, maintained by an endless string of desperate, indebted caretakers who thought they were just guarding empty buildings. I had destroyed one. The grid was damaged, but it wasn't broken. A sudden, sharp pain flared in the center of my chest. It wasn't the dull ache of my fractured ribs. It was a sharp, piercing heat, exactly like the burning iron of the boiler room valves. I dropped the journal gasping, and gripped my shirt. The pain intensified, a sudden spike of adrenaline flooding my system. I stumbled away from the desk, knocking the cheap plastic chair backward, and made my way into the cramped, filthy bathroom. I braced my good hand against the sink and looked in the cracked, stained mirror. I looked awful. My face was hollowed out, dark purple bags hanging under my eyes. My skin was pale and drawn, but that wasn't what made my breath catch in my throat. I grabbed the collar of my borrowed hoodie and pulled it down, exposing the center of my chest, directly over my sternum. Pulsing just beneath the surface of my pale skin was a network of thin, black lines. They looked like veins, but the blood flowing through them wasn't red. It was thick, dark, and shifting. I pressed my fingers against the skin. It was burning hot to the touch. As I watched, the faint, sickly green luminescence I remembered from the entity's core pulsed weakly beneath my flesh. Thump, hiss, thump, hiss. The entity hadn't been entirely sucked into the void. A new core is required, it had said. A new heart to pump the rot. When the containment field collapsed, the entity was dragged into the dark, but in its final, desperate moment of survival, it had splintered. It couldn't take my soul, so it planted a seed. A microscopic fragment of its own geometric static, wired directly into my nervous system. I wasn't just a survivor anymore. I was infected. I was a carrier. I stared at the black veins pulsing over my heart. I expected to feel panic. I expected to feel the crushing, paralyzing terror I had felt on the ice of the lake, or hanging upside down in the ballroom. But as I looked at the dark mark of the Blackwood Estate, the fear didn't come. Instead, a cold, hard, absolute clarity washed over me. The kind of clarity that only comes when you realize you have absolutely nothing left to lose. The entity thought it had cursed me. It thought it had turned me into a walking battery, a beacon that would eventually draw it back to the surface. It thought it had won a Pyrrhic victory. It made a massive miscalculation. By tying itself to my biology, it had inadvertently given me the one thing the architect society had tried to hide for a century. It gave me the frequency. I could feel the faint, distant hum of the other four nodes vibrating in the back of my skull. I didn't just have a map in a journal anymore. I had a compass buried in my chest. I let go of my shirt and stood up straight in the dingy bathroom. I didn't look like a victim. I looked like a man who had seen the bottom of the abyss, spit in its eye, and crawled back out holding the matches. I walked back out into the motel room. I picked up the plastic chair, set it upright, and sat back down at the desk. I closed Arthur's journal and placed my hand flat against the worn leather cover. The first rule they teach you about guarding an empty building is that no building is ever truly empty. But the rule they never teach you, the rule you have to learn by surviving the dark, is that a building is only as strong as its foundation. If you strike the foundation hard enough, even the most elaborate, terrifying architecture in the world will crumble into ash. I looked at the map one last time. Maine, Louisiana, New York, New Mexico, for prisons left to burn, for engines left to shatter. I packed my few belongings into a plastic grocery bag. I didn't have much. Just the clothes on my back, a few $100s in cash, a stolen hospital hoodie, and a book bound in blood and horror. But it was enough. It was more than society had planned for. I walked out of the motel room and stepped into the freezing Colorado night. The neon sign buzzed overhead, casting long, wavering shadows across the empty parking lot. I didn't look back at the mountains. I had already finished my shift there. I started walking toward the bus station. It was going to be a long trip to the coast of Maine. I needed to find a lighthouse. I needed to find the gaps in its geometry. And when I did, I was going to turn the wheels to the right, lock them down, and let the whole damn thing burn. The dark thinks it can hide behind locked doors and shifting hallways. It thinks it can feed in the silence without consequence. But it forgot one crucial detail. It forgot to kill the watchman. If you enjoyed this descent into the dark, don't forget to subscribe to Late Night Stories. Sleep tight, and never turn around when you hear footsteps in an empty hall.